What do you get when you put a conservative leader in a studio with two presenters who seem more interested in talking about someone who isn't even there? A masterclass in media bias and a Twitter meltdown that's still going strong. Good Morning Britain just hosted Kemi Badenoch to mark her first anniversary as Conservative Party leader. You'd think they'd want to discuss her vision, her policies, maybe what the Tories have planned for the next election. But no, instead, Ed Balls and Susanna Reid spent half the interview grilling her about Nigel Farage, not his policies in relation to hers, not a comparison of conservative values, but literally about allegations from his school days and whether she'd do a deal with reform. The result? Viewers absolutely tore into the presenters, calling them biased, desperate, and obsessed with Farage. One viewer summed it up perfectly, saying GMB was as biased as the BBC, which, if you know anything about British media discourse, is basically the nuclear option of insults. Welcome back to UK Political Insight, where we break down the media circus and the political chaos that comes with it. Let's get into why this interview went so spectacularly wrong. So the setup is straightforward enough. Kemi Badenoch joins Good Morning Britain fresh off celebrating 1 year as leader of the Conservative Party. This should be her moment, a chance to set out her stall, explain what the Tories stand for under her leadership, differentiate herself from the chaos of previous Conservative governments, and make the case for why voters should give them another chance. She's got a platform, she's got airtime, she's ready to go. Except Ed Balls and Susanna Reid had other plans. Plans that apparently involved talking about Nigel Farage more than they talked about actual conservative policy. The interview starts off normally enough. Badenoch dismisses comparisons with Keir Starmer, calling him weak and accusing him of floundering around. Fair game, that's what opposition leaders do. They attack the government. But then, within minutes, Susanna Reid pivots. Badenoch claims the Conservatives are the only party making the correct decisions for the country, and Reid immediately brings up Reform UK and Nigel Farage. She says leaving the ECHR is also a reform policy, and Reform are absolutely miles ahead of you on immigration, which is the big issue for voters. Then she asks whether it's time for the Conservatives to consider making a deal with Reform. Now, that's a valid question in isolation. Reform is surging in the polls, immigration is a massive issue, and there's been speculation about potential electoral pacts between the Tories and Reform. So asking about it makes sense. But here's where it gets weird. Badenoch gives a clear answer. Absolutely not. This is not the time to be talking about any sort of deals. She goes on to explain that Reform doesn't have any plans. They're just saying whatever to whoever. And the Conservatives aren't interested in deals for the sake of getting back into power. She even lists actual conservative policies. A cheap power plan, abolishing stamp duty, abolishing business rates on the high street. Real, concrete proposals. And how do the presenters respond? By focusing on a slip of the tongue where Badenoch said we are doing deals before correcting herself to we're not doing deals. Reid pounces on this like it's some huge gotcha moment. She points out the slip and Badenoch has to reaffirm her position. No deals with Reform. Reform are not a conservative party. They want to spend more money on welfare while we're talking about reducing welfare. They're talking about nationalizing Rolls-Royce and oil and gas. We believe in unleashing business and letting the private sector deliver growth. It's a comprehensive explanation of the ideological differences between the Conservatives and Reform. It's exactly the kind of substantive political discussion you'd want in an interview. And it gets almost completely ignored because the presenters are too busy trying to manufacture drama over a verbal stumble. But the interview takes an even more bizarre turn when Ed Balls finally enters the discussion. And what does he decide to ask about? Not economic policy, not defense, not healthcare. He asked Badenoch about allegations of racism made against Nigel Farage by one of his former school pupils. Let me repeat that. Ed Balls, interviewing the leader of the Conservative Party, decides to spend time asking her about alleged comments Nigel Farage made when he was at school. Not about Farage's current policies, not about whether his party represents a threat to democracy or democratic norms, but about something someone claims he said decades ago. And then he plays a clip from a previous GMB interview featuring this former pupil making the accusations. Balls asks Badenoch whether this is ancient history or whether it says something about Farage's character today. And Badenoch, to her credit, handles it brilliantly. She says what it says about his character is that he hasn't been able to apologize. She acknowledges that all of us have said and done things we regret, which is why she's made a big deal about acknowledging the mistakes the Conservative Party made in government. She redirects the conversation to whether Farage still holds those alleged beliefs today, rather than relitigating decades-old accusations. It's a masterclass in deflection, but the presenters won't let it go. They both press her on whether she believes Farage holds those views now, and she responds honestly, "I don't know. This happened before I was born. He's an old guy, and he should come out and explain why he can't apologize. I think he needs to apologize." Now, let's pause here and think about what's happening. Kemi Badenoch is the leader of His Majesty's opposition. She's the person who could potentially be the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. She's got policies, she's got a vision, she's got critiques of the current government. And Good Morning Britain is spending precious interview minutes asking her to psychoanalyze Nigel Farage based on allegations from his school days that she wasn't even alive to witness. It's absurd, it's journalistically bankrupt, and viewers noticed. The interview does briefly move on to what the Conservatives would implement if they were re-elected. Badenoch talks about overhauling Labour's tax measures on private schools and farmers. Finally, some actual policy discussion. But even this gets derailed because Ed Balls decides to bring up Farage again. He points out that Farage says he won't promise tax cuts because it would be irresponsible without knowing the state of public finances. But Badenoch is promising to abolish stamp duty, so isn't she doing what Farage calls risky and irresponsible? Badenoch hits back perfectly. She says the Conservatives have explained where the money's coming from. Farage promised £90 billion worth of tax cuts, which he then abandoned. If Farage had won the election, he would have broken every single promise. It's a solid response. She's pointing out that reform talks a big game, but doesn't have the detailed plans to back it up. And then Balls asks whether Farage is the Liz Truss of British politics. The Liz Truss of British politics. He's literally trying to get Badenoch to insult Farage by comparing him to the disastrous former Conservative Prime Minister who lasted 49 days in office. And Badenoch wisely doesn't take the bait. She just says, "I don't know what he is. He's just saying whatever." So, to recap, in an interview with the Conservative Party leader, Good Morning Britain spent more time talking about Nigel Farage than about Conservative policy. They asked about decades-old allegations. They tried to manufacture drama over a verbal stumble. They attempted to get Badenoch to attack Farage personally, and they generally seemed more interested in Reform UK than in the Tories. And viewers were not having it. The backlash on social media was swift and brutal. One viewer raged. Desperate to trip up the Conservative leader, what a toe-curling interview. But Farage, ridiculously biased ITV. Well done, Kemi. Another asked, what a pointless interview that was more about reform than anything else. A third declared, what a terrible interview. I don't know who was worse, Susanna or Ed, and the faces Reid was pulling. What the hell? I think Kemi was looking at them thinking she's on the wrong show. Kemi has my vote. Someone else noted Balls obsessed with Farage, and another said a pathetic shot at Nigel again, showing Kemi footage of that guy about something 50 years ago. One viewer hit out directly at Ed Balls saying, did anyone note the Farage bashing has started by biased Balls? Every opportunity to badmouth him. The comparison to BBC bias is particularly telling. For years, Conservatives have complained that the BBC has a left-wing bias. Whether that's true is debatable, but the perception exists. So when viewers say GMB is as biased as the BBC, they're saying that ITV's morning show has the same problem. They're not being balanced. They're not giving Conservative voices a fair hearing. They're pursuing their own agenda. And in this case, that agenda seemed to be making the interview about Farage rather than about Badenoch or Conservative policy. Now, let's be fair for a moment. Farage and Reform UK are a huge story right now. They're leading in some polls. They're projected to win hundreds of seats if there was an election. They represent a genuine threat to both Labour and the Conservatives. So asking about them isn't inherently wrong. The problem is how the questions were framed and how much time was devoted to the topic. If you're interviewing the conservative leader, the focus should be on the conservatives. You can ask how they plan to compete with reform, you can ask about policy differences, you can ask whether voters who've moved to reform can be won back. Those are all legitimate questions. What you shouldn't do is spend half the interview asking about allegations from Farage's school days or trying to trap your guest into criticizing him personally. That's not journalism, that's gotcha politics. And the thing is, Badenoch handled it well. She stayed on message, she didn't get flustered, she gave substantive answers when she could and deflected when necessary. She came across as competent and in control, which makes the presenter's approach even more baffling. If your goal is to hold politicians to account and inform viewers, you'd think you'd want to ask questions that elicit useful information. Instead, Balls and Reid seemed more interested in creating viral moments and generating controversy. And while that might be good for ratings, it's terrible for political discourse. There's also something deeply ironic about the media's obsession with Farage. They claim he's dangerous. They claim his views are beyond the pale. They claim he shouldn't be given a platform. And yet, they can't stop talking about him. Even in an interview with a completely different politician, they spend half their time discussing him. It's like they're addicted to the controversy he generates. And the more they talk about him, the more relevant he becomes. They're inadvertently